So let's just start with the webinar itself now. So again, thanks for being with us. So Elizabeth Popp-Berman is a professor of sociology and organizational studies at the University of Michigan, and a recent work focuses on the role of economists and economics in public policy. And so we first invited her to talk about her forthcoming book, forthcoming at Princeton University Press. The title is Thinking Like an Economist, How Economics Became the Language of US Public Policy. And so the idea today was, of course, to talk a bit about this research and to see how some insights from this research can help us to think about what's happening today. So after a brief presentation, Mike Kenny will introduce the discussion and me. So Mike is a professor of public policy at Cambridge, and he's also my boss. And so we will try to have a discussion about some aspect of Elizabeth's talk. So thanks again a lot for being online with us. And maybe, Elizabeth, you could start sharing your thought and also your screen with us. And
okay, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. And here should be my screen if you see that now. Are you able to see that, Cleo? Great. All right, well, thank you guys all for being here with us today. I have to say that this was all sort of planned at the last minute as what was going to be a in-person trip and a talk about my forthcoming book was going to happen, but instead, in light of obviously the pandemic and the end of travel and so on and all these things, was sort of converted into more of an open conversation about the relationship between the research that I do and kind of the interests of CRASSH and expertise in economics and politics with the present political moment and crisis that we find ourselves in. And so we ended up with sort of a larger audience. And so this is sort of, which is great. And we're in a little bit more of a presentation format, a little more formal than I was originally planning for. But what I'm going to do, the way we're going to do this today is I'm going to talk for about 20 minutes or so about a little bit first, just enough about my research to give you a sense of how it connects to some of the questions we're going to talk about today. And then I'm going to use that just to ask a couple of questions about what we see in the present moment and introduce some possibilities for different ways of thinking about it. And then we will move into some discussion, first with the moderators and then with the larger set of participants. So again, I'm an associate professor of organizational studies and sociology at the University of Michigan. And the book that I am working on finishing is called Thinking Like an Economist, How Economics Became the Language of US Public Policy. And just to give you the very brief thumbnail version of what it's about, and basically, it's a historical book. I'm looking at how between the 1960s and 1980s, what I call an economic style of reasoning, to borrow Ian Hacking's phrase, became institutionalized in US policymaking through organizational and legal changes. And so this is not just economics in the sense of what people with PhDs in economics might do, but more of a broader Econ 101 way of thinking in terms of trade-offs, costs and benefits, incentives, and so on, that disseminated well beyond just the discipline of economics itself. And so the larger argument of the book is that the values that were centered by this framework, in particular, centering various kinds of efficiency as really a core measure of what makes for good public policy, both was quite successful and also made it harder for policies that were grounded in competing values and ways of thinking about problems, made it harder for those to gain ground. And the political consequences to this in the US were particularly noticeable on the political left, in the left wing of the Democratic Party, which found it harder to advance arguments about things like universalism, equality, and rights that were less easily integrated into an economic framework. So that's the 2-minute version of the book. But I also have this sort of ongoing interest as part of this in the role of numbers in policymaking. And so in the book itself, there's quite a bit of it deals with the rise of cost-benefit analysis in regulatory decision-making in the US. I spend a fair bit of time looking at the rise of the Congressional Budget Office and its role in scoring the cost of legislation, and that helped to frame policy debates in the US. And I've published a number of pieces that touch on this relationship between numbers and policymaking in some way. And the core questions that I'm really interested in are in this tension between our need for numbers on the one hand, in order to find a way to make useful decisions, to commensurate between incompatible things, and their inevitable limitations, all the things that they can't measure, and the moral judgments that go into producing them, but that often get sort of hidden once the numbers are reified. So what I'm going to do today, for the most part, is introduce, is sort of build on some of this work by talking a little bit about some of the questions I've been thinking about and asking myself as I watch the current crisis unfold, just like anybody else is doing, with all the same uncertainty, and this is my living room, and all the other things that go along with that. And so I'm going to talk about 3 questions, each for 5 minutes or so. First, I'm going to ask what we see about how the role of economics is, what kind of role economics is playing in the current policy debate, and whether that role is changing at all. Second, I want to ask how we are thinking about valuing life in the face of massive uncertainty relative to what we've seen in the past. And finally, I want to ask about how we're framing the debate in terms of trade-offs between health and economy, and how we can also go beyond that dichotomy. So first, what is the role that economists have been playing in the current debate? How has this been changing? These are a couple of recent newspaper headlines. Obviously, economics is a discipline that has significant policy influence and has significant authority in the public sphere, and so it is not surprising that we've seen economists be very visible in the current debate over what policy should look like. And this has become only more the case as we have shifted from a focus on the earliest days, where we're just sort of trying to figure out how do we get people inside and promote social distancing and deal with the immediate sense of there being a pandemic, to the situation where we find ourselves increasingly trying to think about, well, what are the long-term consequences of this? How do we manage the enormous economic consequences of our response to the pandemic, as well as how to think about stopping it purely from a public health perspective? And so, on the one hand, what economists have really brought to this debate is, is this sense of thinking about trade-offs, which is not something that was so much part of the earliest debate. The human suffering caused by recessions or depressions is obviously enormous and shouldn't be discounted in the face of trying to save people's lives and trying to limit infection while we look for some kind of vaccine. And so, on the one hand, there's been this public framing of the debate as one in which economists are prioritizing the economy, and epidemiologists and public health people are prioritizing health. But this actually hasn't been one of the most visible messages coming out of economics. This is the University of Chicago's IGM survey of economic experts, looking at the question of how much economic limitations will we have to tolerate in order to, will we have to tolerate a lot of economic costs in order to see the spread of infections drop significantly? And as you can see, the responses are quite heavily, entirely oriented towards economists saying, yes, that we are going to have to tolerate these enormous costs for the short run, even though obviously we would rather not have to make those decisions. At the same time, that doesn't mean that there aren't these big conflicts between economics and other disciplines, as different groups of people try to shape the terms of debate and try to frame the conversations that are going on. And so particularly we've seen epidemiologists and economists sort of pitted against one another sometimes, each bringing different disciplinary frameworks to the table, and beginning with a focus on different sort of prime directives, as it were, that epidemiologists are much less likely to sort of default to thinking about costs and benefits and trade-offs, and rather are first centering the question of how do we limit disease, how do we limit death, regardless of the cost. Whereas trade-offs are, of course, economists' advantage, but economists are also sometimes not taking into account just how many assumptions are going into the models in ways that are under conditions that are just an order of magnitude more uncertain than they have been before. But one thing I want to kind of remind everybody is that both economists and epidemiologists are existing in a world in which expertise in general is under considerable threat. And so on the one hand, we see people in positions of authority who are turning to people who are at least nominally associated with the discipline in order to make claims that are going to advance a particular political position or another. So, for example, this is from yesterday's Washington Post, talking about Trump advisor and economist Kevin Hassett, making a claim that would be, certainly very academically marginal, but nevertheless is politically important. That he has made a model that currently shows that deaths in the U.S. from coronavirus are going to go to zero by May 15th. And in the U.S. in particular, we're in this environment in which expertise can't stay out of this larger political polarization. So this is a picture of protesters in Sacramento, arguing that we should not, that it's a violation of liberties to have our freedom of mobility restricted. And in the face of this environment of intense political polarization, there's no way that rational debate and academic disagreement are going to be the factors that decide whose models end up getting taken most seriously. I'd also point to the fact that neither of these debates exists outside of some kind of larger political discourse. So people who are modeling are making choices about what to focus on, what to include, what to leave out. And those are very much shaped by political events, by political pressures. And as political discourse plays out, you see this reflected in terms of what gets taken seriously. So for example, in the US, the COVID-19 crisis is also very much a crisis for Black Americans who are very highly disproportionately represented among people who are getting seriously ill and dying. If this is accounted for in models and in decision making, is going to depend partly on what kinds of assumptions people bring to the table, and also on how easy it is to to what extent there is an expectation that such variation is accounted for or not. And I think what we're going to see as a result of this is an evolution in what kinds of issues people are thinking about as they face this new reality, and we may see changes in what people actually pay attention to. I just point to some of Dan Hirschman's work on the rise of the study of inequality within economics, which was a fairly marginal topic 20 years ago, but in part because of a growing public sense and a growing political sense that inequality was a major issue that needed to be dealt with, increasingly became an integral part of the discipline and became something that economists were very engaged in explaining both the causes and consequences of. And so ultimately, I think that that a lot of different people are going to be radicalized by the fallout of this crisis in a variety of different ways. And that is directly and indirectly going to affect the kinds of knowledge that economists produce. Second, I'm going to ask briefly the question of what it means to think about valuing life under conditions of uncertainty. And again, value of statistical life is not a concept that typically makes the headlines of the newspapers and the television shows, but for a brief moment it is starting to, in part because we're in a situation where we very clearly need to think about how much are we willing to spend, what are we willing to sacrifice in order to save lives. But as I followed this debate, one of the things I found really interesting at the present moment is the challenge around using the value of statistical life to weigh policy trade-offs right now. So I imagine many of you are familiar with the concept, but for those who might not be, value of statistical life is basically a convention that places on a number on what we as a society are willing to spend in order to save one additional life. So for example, if we want to weigh the costs and benefits of legislating a restriction in the maximum amount of fine particulates that can be in the air, what costs are what are we willing to pay for the likelihood that we're going to save one additional life as a result of those regulations. And value of statistical life has a very interesting history. It was quite controversial in its early days. And even now, people often have a knee-jerk reaction to the idea of putting a dollar figure on somebody's life, even if it's a statistical life. This is a quote from an interview with Spencer Bonsoff, who has a terrific paper, The Cold War Origins of the Value of Statistical Life, in which he talks about how much resistance there was in the 1950s when economists at Rand were developing some of these arguments, and they were trying to think about, well, how do you what are the costs of and benefits of various kinds of military strategies? Well, you have a couple of options. If you think that one of the things that is going to be a cost is that your pilots are going to be killed, and that's gonna you don't want that to happen. On the one hand, if you don't account for that, you have you're effectively saying their lives are worth nothing, and the Air Force didn't like that. On the other hand, if you put a dollar figure on their lives, that has its own baggage that comes along with it. And so they found themselves trying to dance around it because it was such an unacceptable idea. Historically, just to plug this paper by Catherine Hood on the adoption of value of statistical life in U.S. regulatory systems. Originally the most common way to value life was based on sort of a human capital model in which people's lives had value depending on what their expected future earnings were, which of course had the negative effect of assigning very little value to anybody who did not have earnings, which a woman at the time or retired or a lower wage earner had significant sort of moral implications. But by the 1970s, people had switched to a willingness to pay approach, originally proposed by Thomas Schelling, in which the general idea was that we can estimate how much we have to pay people in order to accept particular risks. So if you look at people who have jobs that aren't dangerous and people who have jobs with similar skill levels but that require you to take some risk with your safety or with your life, how much of a wage premium is associated with those kinds of jobs. And so today, while there's not one official figure used, in the US, in regulatory agencies, it tends to hover somewhere around $10 million is the cost that we are willing to pay in order to save an additional life. But one of the interesting things that is going on right now is that people are trying to use value of statistical life as a metric for thinking about the costs and benefits of different decision-making paths at this time. But it is extremely difficult to do. And so on the one hand, it's unsurprising that this is what policy-oriented economists do. It's not surprising that this would be the reaction. But but we're doing this in the face of uncertainties that are just in terms of orders of magnitude. We still have very little idea of very wide ranges of projections of what the likely death rates are likely to be in 6 months or years. Very wide ranges of projections in terms of what the economic impacts are going to be. There's the possibility of major political changes that might affect either of those. And so the debate often gets hooked onto this sort of false precision of what kinds of what we can estimate in terms of costs and benefits, that then we can sort of make some kind of judgment about, okay, well, we're paying too much to save these lives, or making some other set of decisions would be worth it. And so I think one thing to take away from this is that when we're in a situation where there is so much uncertainty, when models are going to produce these wildly varying results, and where they're very quickly picked up into public discourse and not just in academic debates, the things that are going to determine whether they get attention aren't how realistic their assumptions are or not, or whether they're making reasonable choices about those. Instead, they're going to get attention based on things like the positions of the authors. So, this is a Marshall Revolution post from yesterday about all-star economists writing a COVID-19 paper that's getting quite a bit of attention. They may get attention because of the political implications of their results. They're producing results that are appealing to one party or another in terms of the policy they want to advocate, or they get attention because they are media friendly. They go viral, and not necessarily, again, because of anything to do with the realism of their assumptions. And the third question I will just touch on briefly is the one of how we should think about whether there is a health economy trade-off here. And why is this the way that we frame the debate? Again, here are a couple more recent headlines of in the US, at least, we're weighing the trade-offs between protecting public health and opening up the economy. This is very much how the public debate is being framed, that we have a choice between staying at home and saving lives, but at great economic expense, or we can save the economy and protect people's well-being, but it's going to cost lives. And so on the one hand, this is a very understandable framing that obviously if we all stay at home and lots of us don't go to work, we're going to be less economically productive. But a lot of discussion within economics is also very much framed explicitly in terms of this trade-off right now. Again, this is from a recent National Bureau of Economic Research paper that was put out, but just as an illustration, showing how you can look at the set of different policy options in terms of Pareto frontier between the number of deaths that you can choose or some degree of loss of output, and looking for some kind of optimal location there. And I want to emphasize again that a lot of economists have also made the case that in the situation that we currently find ourselves in, the health costs, the costs in terms of loss of life, are so huge that even really massive economic costs are still worth it, because the alternative right now is so much worse, and we have very little choice. So you also see these sort of competing headlines of, there is no trade-off between health and the economy, because in order to save the economy, we need to protect people's health in the first place. So I don't want to oversimplify in terms of what the debate actually looks like. But I still think that there is a limitation in this broader framing of thinking about trade-offs between health and the economy, which is that they're limited by the framework that they start with. And in particular, if you take the current organization of the economy as given, if you take the current political system and political moment that we find ourselves in as given, and assume that nothing larger about our political economic system is going to change as a result of this massive pandemic, then it does in fact maybe make sense to think about policy choices as looking for some kind of optimum in the space between deaths and output reduction. But I would also like to propose that this may be a moment where we can think about things changing more dramatically. What if this is a time when we have the potential to reorder our economy in ways that are potentially better for people who are working terrible jobs, that produce benefits that are reach the larger population as a whole, and that don't just largely accrue to the people at the top of the economic ladder? And what if there are decisions we can make that improve both? Some of these may be things like employing massive numbers of people to do contact tracing, which can be both something that mitigates economic fallout while also helping to contribute to the public health response. But I want to end my comments by just suggesting that we can think out of the box even further than that. That if we go outside of the box of thinking about people's income and unemployment and GDP and really ask ourselves questions about whose lives are going to be better and worse at the end of this, and then what kinds of material conditions are necessary to enable those possibilities. These are questions that may not be amenable to modeling and that aren't really necessarily addressable easily within the framework of economics, even though economists may have ideas about them. But if we think if we think on a larger scale about the political possibilities of the moment, and that we may be able to make decisions that place us in a position where, where in the US, we no longer have a system where so many people have very limited access to healthcare, that we start to set ourselves up to address other kinds of pressing problems like climate change, that limiting ourselves to a framework that sees health and economy as fundamentally being about trade-offs is ultimately a failure of imagination. All right, so I will stop there and
Great. Thanks a lot. It's very frustrating that, we can't all react to what you just say, but I hope, I'm sure people are in agreement with me that it was great questions. I think I will just briefly ask you 3 short questions to that sometime to locate Mike in the audience. So what surprised you in the politics of expert knowledge, if anything happened, if anything surprised you? The second question is a bit broad, but it's linked to the consequence of making numbers and the form the form of these numbers. So the question is, what about the curve as an artifact that we can all follow? And especially you talk about the production and the discourse of experts, but on the other hand, how people receive those numbers, I think is very interesting. And especially in the case of the curve, that you have a sort of immediate intuitive way to understand it, or maybe not. And the last question is about the limits of, so you talk about the limits of modeling and also the limit of the use of modeling. And I guess economists are very aware of the limits of their models. They cannot completely control how they use. And I would like to hear what you think about, is this distinction between the use and the model itself, is it possible to make the distinction when you have, in fact, sort of, when you talk both of style of reasoning that are part of a broader social process, which is something different from the model itself? And so, is it possible to do this distinction? And if it is, what's the sort of responsibility of economists being misunderstood, if I may say things like this. So I give you, some time to answer, and then maybe Mike could also have a question. Thanks.
Yeah, great. No, thanks. Those are really good questions. I mean, I think so. The first question is what's surprising about the sort of the response of experts in this present moment. I mean, I think I would say two things have really struck me in watching all this. One is how radically all of our reactions, all of our ideas about both what the near and long-term possibilities actually are have really changed so quickly. You know, if you think back to February, it just seemed impossible that we could all be locked in our houses for 6 or 8 weeks. And then that happened, and we sort of, you know, started to face that reality. At the same time, you know, the idea that this could seriously be a crisis that that was going to be fundamentally reorganizing our lives for 12 or 18 or 24 months was itself very hard to process. And so I think that, you know, I think that experts of whatever kind of, maybe the epidemiologists were a little bit better about taking this all in, but that the way people are thinking about this problem is rapidly changing, because it's so hard to wrap our heads around what the actual future might look like. You know, that we're just sort of dealing with the problem of the moment, and sort of how do we think about, you know, the next 6 or 8 weeks before we have to think about this longer time period when we are trying to, you know, make some kind of more fundamental longer term decisions. You know, I think the other thing that's interesting to me is, in the face of crisis, how rapidly you see people being willing to consider options that were considered relatively radical a couple of months ago. You know, sometimes that's just about the massive size of the changes, but you know, I think, for example, that I see, you know, that the idea of having sort of a massive jobs program, a massive government-run jobs program, just even with sort of the shift leftward of political discourse in the U.S. over the last couple of years, still was just not, you know, something that was really very seriously considered. And now you see, you know, I feel like I see very mainstream economists saying, yes, what we need is to employ, you know, millions of people to do public work that isn't going to get done otherwise. And I think that's a really interesting and striking change. And I think it also really reflects the way to which, you know, in a lot of ways, expertise follows political change and isn't the cause of it, right? That experts of whatever stripe are also just people living in these, you know, in this larger political and social environment, who are themselves trying to make sense of what's going on, and what seems like the conventional wisdom can change very quickly. So the second question was about the curve, was about the the curve that we're all trying to flatten, and sort of the power of that as an object. And I think that's really interesting to think about, is the potential value of simple, you know, simple graphics, simple concepts for reaching the public imagination and conveying these kinds of concepts. And you know, that was such a powerful idea in terms of getting people to understand, getting people to think about you know, why it made a difference if we got all the cases at once, versus figured out some kind of way to slow out the spread, even if it didn't make a huge difference in the long run in terms of the number of people who were going to get sick. And so, on the one hand, I think that it's good to be aware of those, of the value of those kinds of devices, because you know, there's the potential that there are other kinds of similar devices that we might use to convey important ideas, and maybe we should be really very actively looking for those. On the other, you know, I've also written a paper about the Laffer curve and its political impact. And so, you know, so the idea that you've got a very catchy device that clearly and quickly conveys a simple idea can also have very, you know, even it can also be very much not accepted by, you know, by mainstream economists or whatever kinds of experts, and yet still have serious political consequences, because it does the same thing of being so easy to understand and really conveying this political idea that you know, that people then pick up and act on. So so I think it's important, but it's not like it's a riskless strategy either. And then, yeah, and so then the third question was about the limits of modeling and the uses of modeling. And I guess I would just say, I do think models have a lot of value. I think it's worthwhile to be doing, simple models, complex models, like all sorts of different ways of thinking about the range of possibilities. I guess I have maybe two thoughts about how to handle those limitations. I think one is just that it is very tempting to produce precise numerical estimates of things in a context in which precise numerical estimates are basically meaningless. And so, if I could sort of create a rule for everybody, I would say that people should not be allowed to put those precise estimates in their abstracts at a minimum, and that that we shouldn't have numbers that we know are kind of order of magnitude estimates being put out into public discourse as being real and meaningful, because even though people who are part of the academic discourse may very actively recognize all the limitations of such an estimate and realize that it's just an attempt to think about possible futures, that's not how they get used, and that's not how they have impact. And so I think it would be more responsible to limit the kinds of firm estimates that get put out into the world when we're all really aware of just how much uncertainty is behind any of those estimates. And I guess the other thing I would just say is that I think I would like to see. I think because of the sort of the political authority of economics and the role that economics plays in the public sphere, and the attention that is given to it, I think that that sort of a modeling framework tends to be very influential in ways that sometimes make it hard to think outside of, and hard for people who want to think outside of to be taken seriously. And so I do think that to the extent that debates over what models, whether they're epidemiological models or economic models, debates over what models best explain the current situation aren't going to be, are going to make it harder to ask other kinds of questions that are less amenable to modeling. And so that's where I think you have the big political economy questions that are fundamentally at least as important, and in some ways more important, because they're sort of setting the parameters for all these other modeling conversations that are going on. And so I guess it's not that I would want to do with models, but would like to see them used in the context of realizing that there's also a larger framework of questions that they fit within, and that we should take those as seriously as well.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think the framing effect of some of this is really is even more important than the discourse itself sometimes. So I think Mike is here and also have questions.
Yeah, thanks, Claire, and thanks very much, Elizabeth. I really enjoyed those very stimulating reflections. Just a first initial thought is that that binary, the debate between a paradigm that focuses on health as opposed to one that focuses on the economy is very much alive and well here in the UK too. So a lot of what you said resonated. I've just got a couple of thoughts that I'll try and channel into questions. I should say I'm coming at this, I guess, more from a political science background, but also somebody interested in public policy, and share some of your interests in the impact of economic reasoning in the policy process. But the two things I wanted to just touch on or raise with you. First, I just wanted to ask you try and draw you out a little bit more on what you think might be the impact of this ongoing crisis on economics as a discipline. And of course, it may be too early to tell, but I just wonder whether you could reflect on that a bit more, perhaps in the context of thinking about the last big crisis that affected economics, which is the financial and banking crises of 2007 to 8, and the intense debate that that generated about economics, both within the profession, but also within wider public discourse. I ask this because I sense you think this might be a moment for change and for some radical questioning. And let me put to you a slightly more pessimistic view, which is that, I mean, at the moment, of course, you know, we're only at a certain point in this and things could change, but at the moment, the disciplines that are central, as you say, are epidemiology and I guess public health, and certainly in Europe, behavioral science. And those appear to be more in the firing line, if you like, and more prominent within the sort of discourse about expertise. But I guess the other point, which as you well know, is that in terms of thinking about the impact that academics have, that experts can have, I mean, that clearly is mediated by the different institutional settings and by the politics in which ideas are being advocated. So there are clearly some very stark political factors and contingencies which are shaping the question of which experts get listened to and which findings become prominent. So here in the UK, there's been this big focus on this study, epidemiological study from Imperial College, which is presented as changing the government's mind because it started to listen to science. And clearly that wasn't the case. The politics had shifted within the government, and there was a sense of being politically primed to listen to that kind of expertise. So I guess I wonder too, actually, as well, whether, because, as you know, bureaucracies and many politicians are quite deeply socialized into thinking about the economy as the primary goal of public policy, won't that become the normal once we move out of this sense of emergency, and economic forms of calculation are quite likely to be valorized once more? So I'd be interested in those questions, what you think the longer term impact is of this crisis. And then secondly, briefly, just on the health economy trade-off, the way the argument is framed. I mean, one of the things, as an outsider, it seems that maybe both of those paradigms share, which you touched on, is a difficulty with the profound challenges of uncertainty. And in particular, I mean, there are different reasons, perhaps we could have another separate conversation about why the modelers find it either difficult to build, to sort of be aware of the limited nature and the assumptions that go into their models, or the lack of engagement with cultural context and behavioral patterns of human agents. Or maybe it's a challenge of communicating when you're in the public realm in this kind of intense media culture, it's very difficult to convey uncertainty. I just wondered what you thought, whether you think those experts should be doing more to try to be more explicit about uncertainty, and whether you even think, as some have argued, that there's a kind of responsibility incumbent upon them to be more open about the provisional nature of findings, and maybe even about some of the normative values built into their models.
Yeah, no, those are also really useful questions. I mean, I think so. The first question, what I think that the impact of this crisis might be on economics as a discipline. Yeah, no, I think about your point about the financial crisis is a really good one, right? Because on the one hand, it seemed like this was a moment where it might cause some kind of fundamental reckoning, and there was a lot of sort of discussion both in and outside of economics about, do we need some kind of fundamental rethinking and efforts along that way? And, instead, 5-10 years later, not that much has actually changed, right? That it didn't cause some kind of fundamental reckoning. And so on the one hand, I do think there's a real possibility that could also be what happens this time, that we sort of end up with basically a return to a new normal that looks not so different from the old normal. I guess the reason that I do feel a little more optimistic or think it might be a little bit more likely that we would see some kind of fundamental changes. Just I feel like that we're sort of seeing a series of cracks in the foundations of our assumptions, and that the financial crisis was sort of one set of cracks in that. The current moment is another set of cracks. I think there are going to be climate catastrophes that are going to continue to sort of shatter our assumptions about how we should think about what is going on. And I think that eventually those are going to cause more radical changes. And I also think that like you said, that a lot of what happens in expert spaces and a lot of what happens in terms of which experts end up being paid attention to in the political sphere is something that follows economics and is not preceded by it. And so on the one hand, you have people in the Trump administration who have advanced degrees and are nominally associated with particular disciplines, but who are making arguments that are very outside of what would be the academic mainstream. But they become taken seriously. I think there you have a situation where the political impact ends up being important, but it doesn't really feed back into the discipline. But I also think about the economic arguments that are happening on the political left, and some of these are more radical arguments about the need to address inequality. Some of them are arguments about putting race more at the center of economic analysis. You see this on the macro side with the whole MMT phenomenon and sort of being increasingly taken seriously in the political sphere. And I think it kind of remains to be seen whether if political currents carry those kinds of voices more into the center of policy debate, does that actually end up feeding back into what is considered the mainstream of the discipline? How does that feed back into academic work? And I think there are possibilities that it could change in a radical way. So, I wouldn't make any predictions, but I do think, and I don't be somebody who's terribly optimistic about change, but I do think this is a moment where there is real uncertainty, and it's really that we could see larger changes than we did even after 2008. And then, the other question was about how do we think about, how should we think about the challenges of uncertainty? Like, how should experts deal with the fact that we do realize all the limitations on what we know? I think this is really a difficult question, because on the one hand, I would say, yes, it's absolutely incumbent on people who are going to participate as experts in the public sphere in some way to be really explicit about the limitations of the kinds of claims that they can make, and to try to be honest to their own understanding of both what the possibilities are, but how much uncertainty there is around that potential future. But at the same time, I think it's also extremely difficult to that the more you sort of acknowledge, the way that you gain attention in a public way is not just to spend your time saying that you're incredibly uncertain and you think this is possibly what might happen, but really nobody knows, and it could be any one of this very large range of outcomes, but to make bold and aggressive claims. And so I think the things that are sort of scientifically responsible or responsible from an academic perspective are at the same time not going to be the ones that are most politically effective. And so I think it's a very fine line that people who want to participate in policy conversations have to walk in terms of trying to state things in a way that are clear and simple enough to gain some kind of traction, but at the same time not that really continue to center how little we know and how much is up in the air as we try to sort of wrap our minds around what's going on right now.
Thanks a lot. I think it's linked also to what you say about the difference between giving a very precise number to the world versus, a judgment really emphasizes the uncertainty. I just wanted to say that we already be online for 1 hour. We still have half an hour, and we really want you to stay with us, because I can see very interesting question, if not concise question, on the chat. So I will give the mic to Christina, who will read some of them to us and to you. So I don't know if you can hear me, Christina.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. So I'm just going to be reading through some of the questions that have come through the chat and a couple that have come through from Twitter. So there's a couple of questions. I was going to read out 2 at a time, Elizabeth, if that's okay.
Sure.
Yeah. So the first question was by Marshall Steinbaum, and it sort of focused on the kind of graph that you showed about the IGM poll. So the question is, the idea that there's no trade-off between health and economic outcomes seems odd as a public posture for economists to take, especially in its most ambitious form, that you showed that all economists strongly agree that there is no trade-off. It seems like a paper, Chernow-Zukov paper, represents the erosion of that claim. So the question is about, what work do you think the claim that there is no trade-off does as an example of public messaging by economists on behalf of economics as a discipline to appear as a unified field?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
What would you prefer? Would you prefer to take them one at a time, or it's up to you?
Well, let's do that one at a time, at least. I think in that case, I think it's a really interesting question, because I think this is an example of where you see, I think what this is a reflection of how economists' views are being shaped by the conventional wisdom and how it's evolving over a relatively brief period of time, just as much as everybody else's, right? And so I think there was this this sort of strong feeling among in academic communities, which included economists at the beginning, that that we just had to convince people to act, and that that it was clear from epidemiologists that the costs in terms of life were going to be so high that there was just this very quick sense that even if you are an economist and your sort of starting point tends to be to think of what the trade-offs are in terms of the cost of doing this, that people very quickly got on board with it. So you see that poll where the result is that that nobody in this survey thought that it wasn't worth accepting substantial economic losses. And then as the political context is shifting, I think you're seeing people's experts' opinions shifting as well. And I think that's sort of following the politics of it, that as we have sort of, I think both as it drags on and people sort of really grapple with the idea that, again, this isn't a crisis of a month or 2 or 3, but this is going to be a longer term issue to deal with. And is the reality of just how extreme the immediate economic consequences have been, and how much the unemployment, how rapidly the unemployment rate has shot up, for example, that what we're seeing is economists basically following everybody else's conventional wisdom too, and of course it's being channeled through the particular disciplinary framework, but that the result you see in that poll, which I think might have, I'm not sure what the date was, but it was it was at least a month ago, might not necessarily be what you would see if you took it again today, when I'm betting that probably opinion is becoming a bit more fragmented, as people are saying, that economists are saying, well, some costs are too high, and that we could really think about trying to find an optimal policy versus one that is going to be, versus just saying we have to do whatever it takes in order to, stop the pandemic, save people's lives.
So we have a next question from Richard Lane on Twitter. The question is, what relationships does Beth see between the historical development of this economic style of reasoning and the historical development of neoliberalism understood as a discrete project associated with the Mont Pelerin Society thought collective, as in the work of Mirowski and Slobodian?
That's an interesting question. I think that the relationship is indirect, right? I mean, the story that I tell in my book, which is very much a story of policymakers and government agencies and bureaucrats in the U.S., is not a story of the Mont Pelerin version of the neoliberalism story at all. It's a story about sort of centrist technocrats who had particular techniques for thinking about how to make better government decisions, and who were able to disseminate kind of a cost-benefit way of thinking through graduate programs in public policy, through creating offices in different parts of government and so on. And in that sense, I think a lot of the framework that underlies this was already well in place, by the 1970s, and by the time that the free market neoliberalism sort of began to have a really more significant political impact in the sort of years leading up to the election of Reagan. I mean, at the same time, I think there's no question that having the rise of another framework for thinking about the appropriate relationship between government and the economy sort of changed the center of gravity for everybody. And so I think you see that the fact that you do have an organized community of people who are not really interested in thinking about, well, how do we improve government decision making, but who are starting from the assumption that government action is probably going to be misguided and for the most part should be limited, is actually not very useful in terms that changed how everybody had to talk about their problems. And so I guess I would say it's not that it didn't have an influence, but it was more in sort of changing the broader conversation that was going on in ways that everybody had to respond to, rather than being sort of a direct cause of the least of the changes that I look at.
Great. We have a comment from Jan Giraud. There is another subject that economists have been quite vocal about in relation to the COVID-19 crisis, and it's that of individual freedom and the consequences of tracing and other sorts of tools used by the government in order to prepare for this next stage. Have you reflected about this?
I haven't reflected about it so much in the context of economists' position on it. I mean, I think it is. I think it's a really vital question, and not one that's limited to being of interest to economists. That I do think we're very much in the situation of we're in a moment of crisis, and we are likely to trade off a lot of privacy and freedom in order to feel like we can regain some kind of control over that. At the same time, I think that once you make those changes and make those concessions, there's no going back from them. So just like after September 11th, you see the erosion of a lot of different kinds of civil liberties that never really turned around in the U.S. I do think that it's going to be very hard to resist the desire to do things like require everybody to download contract chasing apps that that concede big chunks of civil liberties in ways that are not going to be easily reversed after that's done.
And another comment from Haramas, who would like to hear something more about the different spheres in which cost-benefit analysis is accepted and where it is not, and then in what kind of situations. For instance, not environmental damage, but maybe it's okay in health budgeting.
Yeah, I mean, I think my sense is that at least thinking of it in the U.S. policy context, I think that there may be two things that affect where cost-benefit analysis is accepted or not. I think one is to what extent do you have decisions that are being made inside a relatively self-contained community of experts? So I think that if you have regulatory decisions that are being made kind of in the bowels of a government agency somewhere, and they're not getting huge amounts of public attention, and it's mostly people who are having a debate who can agree on, you know, a set of starting premises and include cost-benefit analysis as an appropriate way of thinking about problems. You know, I think those are the situations in which you see the least resistance or pushback and the most acceptance. I think the more you end up getting into more open conversations where you don't necessarily have, or you have sort of a broader public chiming in one way or another, and where the fundamental idea that you know, that thinking about costs and benefits, you know, thinking about putting a dollar figure on life, is just fundamentally morally problematic. You know, I think that's when you see it be less accepted. And so, you know, for example, I think anytime that you have you know, I think you see this more in health policy, for example, than environmental policy. Just to pull one thing from the news a few years ago, you know, there was a proposal to discount the lives of old people by a small amount, or by a certain amount, because, you know, they had statistically had fewer years left to live, and thus, you know, the saving their lives wasn't quite as valuable. And on the one hand, if that was something that just got debated purely within academic circles and never got sort of engaged with by a broader public, I think that maybe that would have had some, you know, that could have been something that ended up being written into policy. But because it did become a much more public debate, and then it becomes like, you know, well, why is grandpa's life less than anybody else's? You know, everybody has that the public's understanding and willingness to accept certain assumptions is going to be much different than within a particular community of experts. And so that sort of how public is the debate, I would say, is a big factor in determining how much a cost-benefit framework is accepted.
I think, thanks a lot. I think we will have to start taking question more, yeah, like two question by two question. And Aro, just say thanks.
Okay, we have one question which is about whether there are missing data points when arguing in the case of economic output versus lives, so the trade-off. So the example here is an increase in the death rate would also result in psychological ailments, fear, anxiety, loss, trauma, depression, and so on, which would all contribute to lower productivity in the short run. So the question is really about whether there are lots of different things which are not considered in this binary. So I guess this is more of a comment, there's no real question. So perhaps you can reflect on this point in just a moment. And we did have another question by Harrow, which was, in addition to his previous one, about what kind of numerical estimates. So let me just clarify. The value of statistical life is now criticized from the right, if I understand the current discussion in the US well, because QALYs might give a better estimate of costs. But of course, these kinds of calculations depend on so many assumptions. So what is the politics of numbers, methods used to calculate them, and who is funding these sometimes private public institutes? Along these lines, I'll just take one more. I should just say briefly that we have tried to pool questions that have come through Twitter, YouTube, and the chat. And we will evaluate how well this has gone for our next one. But the next question has come through from YouTube, which is from Pierre Alarac. Apologies for the pronunciation. So trying to link your different works to the current situation, I'm wondering what you're thinking about the situation of US universities now, not only elite ones, not using endowment.
Okay, so see if I can hit all those questions. So the first was about the all the other downstream effects of the sort of public health implications of the crisis that that are likely to be economic as well, but that don't get considered in the models. Like, so for example, if we're all do people who have been seriously ill and been on ventilators then have PTSD after they recover and come back out into the world? Or how many people have psychological problems as a result of being sort of shut up in isolation alone for months at a time? And I think those are real and important things, but this is also just on the one hand, those are things that can be modeled, that can sort of be brought into a modeling framework, but at the same time, that also kind of point to the limits of modeling, and the fact that people who are, the modelers have to make choices about what to pay attention to and what to not to. And so, so I think that if it became some big issue of public attention, that there were massive, psychological consequences going on as a result of the epidemic, then I would think you would see work starting to reflect that and try to address it more directly. And I'm sure some people are trying to do that, but that how central a question that's seen as being is driven in part by what kinds of questions, in the broader public sphere we see as being most important right now. So the second question was about value of statistical life being criticized by the right, and qualities, which are quality-adjusted life years, being proposed as better, which is a little bit close to the idea of saying that grandpa's life is worth a little less because he has fewer years left to live. I think this is one of those examples where you have this sort of debate that a year ago would have seemed very arcane, and all of a sudden has become very politically significant, because if you decide that you're going to give everybody's life exactly the same value, that obviously has important consequences for what kinds of costs you think are worth it to save those lives. Whereas if we shift to a framework in which we're weighting people's, if we're focusing on how many years of life are less, that's going to point you towards a slightly more limited set of options that appear to be worthwhile. And so I think it's absolutely going to be one of these things where, depending on your political position and what you think the best policy course of action is for other reasons, you are going to favor one of those or the other. And I think this is something that you can see, that has been going on for a very long time. And I think you can see it particularly in the history of environmental regulation, that there have always been, that historically, at least in the 1970s, that it was, conservatives and sort of proponents of, advocates of industry who were most in favor of cost-benefit analysis of environmental regulation, because it so obviously, relative to the existing standard at the time, which was just sort of setting regulatory standards and not necessarily paying attention to the costs at all, it clearly was going to work in the favor of limiting regulation, of making it more restricted. If you start with cost-benefit analysis, over time, as regulation was reined in various ways, then you see the positions reversing, because in light of, in a political environment in which you can just sort of like get rid of regulation entirely, then you maybe don't want to use cost-benefit analysis anymore, because it may actually show that, some regulation is beneficial. And so, right, so I think this is just kind of the latest example of, the longstanding way that political debates get channeled into and then reflect back out, into academic debates. And the last question was, this is more about my other line of work, which is on higher education. But the question was about U.S. universities and whether they should spend down their endowments, which in light of the, again, the current situation that we find ourselves in. I mean, fundamentally, I think that, the U.S. university system has become increasingly and radically stratified in the last 20 years in a way that's very closely related to the growth of endowments, which, again, 20 years ago were much smaller and much less central to the budgets of wealthy or elite universities than they currently were. So I certainly think that, I would prefer to live in a world in which there was not such radical inequality in endowments across institutions. And I think policies that encourage universities to spend down their endowments in order to, preserve jobs in the short term, in order to provide financial aid that's going to keep people enrolled in college at a time when it's going to be increasingly difficult for a lot of people to afford, is a good policy. I think the details of actually how you do that, I'm not sure I have thought through enough to have a position on, but I think it's certainly a conversation worth having.
Okay, thank you. And we do have a few more questions that have come through the chat box, but also on Twitter. We have been prompted to wrap up our session slowly. So this is more of a message to maybe we can continue the conversation through Twitter. One of the things that we'll do is post all these questions in the feed of the event, and perhaps we can have more of an online continuation of some of the remaining questions. So I'll hand over to Cleo. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And thanks everyone for staying with us and for, be patient with us. Thanks a lot, Elizabeth, for this. Thanks, Mike and Christina and all the organizing team, which just on mute right now. And I guess I'll just post our next event on the chat box. We will be next week on the 12th with Eric Agner and Anna Alexandrovna on epistemic humility. And I just want to thank you. And I think we will stop right now.